Sherlock Holmes sat in his chair at 221B Baker Street, fingers pressed together in thought, his sharp eyes fixed on the letter that lay open on the table before him. The edges of the parchment were frayed, the ink smudged in places, as though the writer had penned it in great haste. The air in the room was thick with the lingering scent of pipe smoke, curling into the dim glow of the lanterns that flickered against the wooden walls. Watson sat opposite him, watching in silence, his fingers tightening around the arms of his chair as he observed the way Holmes's gaze never wavered from the letter's contents. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting long shadows against the furniture, but neither man moved. Something about this letter was different. Something about it had settled into Holmes's mind in a way that Watson recognized all too well. Holmes reached forward, lifting the letter between his fingers, tilting it slightly under the lamplight. The handwriting was uneven, hurried, the strokes pressing too deeply into the paper, as though the writer's hand had been shaking. He examined the texture of the ink, the weight of the paper, the faint scent of dampness that clung to its surface. Whoever had written this had done so recently, in a place where moisture lingered in the air, where the ink had barely dried before it had been folded and sent. The letter had arrived earlier that evening, delivered by a boy no older than 12. The child had barely spoken, his voice trembling as he handed over the envelope before darting back into the streets, disappearing into the dense fog that clung to the city. Holmes had watched him go, his mind already unraveling the details. The boy had been barefoot, his clothing torn at the seams, his face smeared with soot. He had not been sent from a place of wealth or comfort. He had come from the streets, from the filth of Whitechapel, and that meant that whatever was in this letter had originated from the same darkness that had gripped that part of London for weeks now. Holmes's eyes moved across the words once more, absorbing them without the need to read them aloud. Mr. Holmes, if you have any power in you, if your mind is as they say, come to Whitechapel at once. Another has been taken, another has been butchered. The devil himself walks these streets and no one can stop him. They say he is a man. I do not believe it. If you come, come alone. Do not tell the police, do not tell anyone. Or you too may disappear into the night. The lack of a signature did not trouble Holmes. Anonymity often carried more weight than a name. But what did trouble him was the urgency in the message, the raw desperation in the way the words had been written. This was not a plea for justice. This was a warning. He stood abruptly, his coat already in his hands before Watson could speak. The doctor watched him, his brow furrowing as he recognized the set of Holmes's jaw, the sharp focus in his eyes. This was not curiosity. This was something else. Holmes did not believe in the supernatural, did not give weight to talk of devils or specters that haunted the night, but he believed in men. And he believed in the kind of fear that only men could instill in others. He moved toward the door, slipping on his gloves with a practiced motion. He knew that Whitechapel was drowning in hysteria. The papers had given the killer a name, Jack the Ripper, but Holmes knew better than to chase ghosts built by headlines. There was a mind behind these murders, a method buried beneath the madness. The killer had eluded the police, had left behind bodies torn apart with surgical precision, had disappeared into the night without a trace. But no man, no matter how careful, was beyond detection. The streets outside were slick with rain, the gas lamps barely cutting through the fog that curled around the buildings like a living thing. Holmes walked with purpose, his coat billowing behind him as his sharp eyes moved across the city with unwavering focus. The air carried the scent of damp stone, of coal smoke from the factories, of something heavier beneath it all, the stench of fear. Whitechapel loomed ahead, its alleys twisting into darkness, its buildings standing like silent witnesses to the horrors that had unfolded in the night. Holmes did not slow his steps. He had read the reports, had studied the details of each victim, had mapped the locations in his mind before ever setting foot on these streets. The killer was not a madman acting on impulse. He was something far worse. He was methodical. And that meant there was a pattern, a logic, a mistake waiting to be found. He turned down a narrow passage, his boots clicking against the wet cobblestone as he moved toward the last known crime scene. The city had tried to wash away the evidence, but Holmes knew that traces always remained. He reached the spot where the body had been found, his gaze sweeping over the alley with meticulous precision. The walls were damp, the ground uneven, the scent of decay still lingering despite the passage of days. He crouched, his fingers brushing lightly over the stone, feeling for disturbances, for anything that did not belong. The police had already searched this place, had deemed it nothing more than another tragic corner of a city drowning in sin. But Holmes saw what they did not. A boot print, larger than most, pressed deep into the mud, but not yet washed away by the rain. He traced the shape with his fingers, noting the weight distribution, the angle. The man who had left this print had been standing still, not in a rush, not fleeing, watching. He straightened, his mind assembling the pieces with precise calculation. The Ripper did not kill in haste. He did not strike out of frenzy. He observed. He planned. He knew these streets like a predator stalking familiar ground. Holmes turned his gaze toward the shadows beyond the alley, toward the narrow passages that twisted deeper into the city. The killer had not simply vanished. He had walked away, knowing that no one was truly watching, but now someone was. Holmes stepped forward, his boots echoing against the stone. The air grew colder, the fog pressing in around him as he moved deeper into Whitechapel's labyrinth of alleys and secrets. He did not hesitate. He did not look back. Somewhere in this city, a monster was walking free, and tonight, Sherlock Holmes was going to find him. Sherlock Holmes moved deeper into the tangled streets of Whitechapel, his boots pressing into the damp cobblestone, his senses sharpening as the air thickened with the weight of unseen eyes. The city carried an unnatural stillness, one that did not belong in a place teeming with life. The gas lamps flickered, casting elongated shadows against the brick walls, stretching them into forms that slithered across the fog. He did not slow his pace. He had followed the trail to this very moment, each step leading him closer to the presence that lurked behind the veil of darkness. The alley narrowed, its entrance framed by the crumbling facades of abandoned buildings. The faint scent of rot and damp earth clung to the air, mingling with something else, something metallic. Blood. Holmes recognized the way it lingered, how the scent did not simply belong to the past, but to the present. The ground was uneven, beneath his feet, littered with debris and discarded remnants of a city that had long forgotten its own people. He stepped forward, his hand brushing against the rough surface of the wall beside him. The moisture seeped into the stone, cold against his fingertips, but beneath it he felt something else. A mark. He traced its shape, his mind cataloging every detail. The carving was shallow but deliberate, etched into the brick with something sharp. A symbol, an insignia, something meant to be left behind. Holmes had seen many messages scrawled in the back alleys of London, but this was different. This was not a sign of territory or a warning from rival gangs. This was a signature. The Ripper was not merely killing. He was leaving behind a piece of himself, something only the observant were meant to find. Holmes withdrew his fingers, his eyes narrowing as he turned his attention to the ground. The mud had settled into deep impressions, footprints layered over one another, but beneath them there was a pattern. A single set of prints that moved with a purpose, stopping near the base of the wall, pausing just long enough to leave the mark before vanishing into the night. The depth of the print told him the man had been standing still, waiting, lingering in his own creation. This was not the work of a man who feared being caught. This was the work of someone who believed he never would be. A sound stirred in the distance, a rustling of fabric against brick, the soft scrape of a heel turning against the stone. Holmes stilled, his breath steady, his heartbeat even. He did not turn immediately. He had learned long ago that the moment before confrontation was the most telling. A man who wished to remain hidden would fade into the shadows, while a man who wished to be seen would reveal himself. The air shifted. The presence behind him did not flee. Holmes turned. A figure stood at the mouth of the alley, just beyond the reach of the flickering lamplight. The shape was tall, draped in a long coat, the brim of a hat casting his face into darkness. He did not move, did not speak. He only stood there, waiting. Holmes felt the air between them grow heavier, the space shrinking though neither had stepped forward. Then the figure moved. Slowly, deliberately, he took a step into the light. The faint glow revealed the sharp angles of his face, the glint of eyes that watched without hesitation. He was clean, far too clean for a man who had walked these streets unnoticed. His coat was tailored, his gloves pristine, his boots polished. He was not a man who belonged in Whitechapel, yet he stood there as if the city itself had bent to his presence. Holmes did not break his gaze. He studied the way the man carried himself, the slight tilt of his head, the careful way he positioned his hands at his sides, not clenched, not ready for violence, but controlled, calculated. The man smiled. It was not a smile of amusement, nor one of kindness. It was the kind of smile that did not reach the eyes, one that belonged to men who enjoyed watching others squirm. Holmes did not move, did not speak. He only observed, allowing the silence to stretch between them like a taut wire. The man was waiting, testing, measuring how long Holmes would stand there before shifting. Then, as if satisfied, the man lifted his hand and tipped his hat slightly. A gesture not of greeting, but of acknowledgement. He was not a man running from the shadows. He was a man who had walked through them unchallenged. Holmes stepped forward. The man did not retreat. For a brief moment, they stood only feet apart, two minds locking in an unspoken understanding. Then, with the ease of someone who had already won, the man turned and disappeared into the fog. His movements were unhurried, his stride precise. He did not look back. Holmes followed. The air was thick with the scent of rain as the fog coiled tighter around the city, muffling the sounds of distant carriages and the drunken murmurs of those who had lost themselves to the night. Holmes moved, swiftly, his eyes tracking the faintest shifts in the mist, the lingering footprints that led deeper into the labyrinth of Whitechapel. He had spent years studying the way men moved when they believed they were unseen. This man was not hiding. He was guiding. The chase led him through passageways barely wide enough for a man to pass through, across wooden planks laid over the murky waters of forgotten canals. Holmes never lost sight of the figure, even as he slipped around corners and vanished momentarily into the depths of the city. The man did not run, did not panic. He was leading Holmes somewhere, drawing him deeper into the night. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the footprints stopped. Holmes came to a halt, his breath steady despite the pace. He stood in the middle of an open courtyard, surrounded by the skeletal remains of abandoned buildings. The silence was deafening. No footsteps, no shifting shadows, only emptiness. He turned slowly, his eyes sweeping the perimeter. The fog had thickened, swirling in slow, deliberate currents as if the city itself had conspired to keep its secrets. The footprints led to this very spot, yet there was no sign of the man. No sound of retreating steps, no indication of where he had gone. Holmes remained still, listening. He had seen men vanish before, had watched criminals slip through the cracks of London like ghosts. But this was different. This was not a man escaping. This was a man who had never intended to be caught. A single breath of wind stirred through the alley, and for the first time in a long time, Holmes felt something unfamiliar creeping at the edge of his mind. Not fear, not uncertainty. Intrigue. This was no ordinary hunt. This was a game, and Sherlock Holmes had just taken his first step onto the board. Sherlock Holmes stood motionless in the center of the empty courtyard, the fog thickening around him, swirling like a living thing. His eyes scanned the surroundings, methodically, but there was nothing. No sign of the figure he had been following. No indication of where the man had gone. The only sound that filled the air was the steady drip of water from the overhanging eaves and the distant hum of the city, muffled by the dense mist that clung to the streets. Holmes stood still, his mind whirring, calculating, deducing the possibilities that had led to this moment. The man had vanished, not into thin air, but into the very fabric of the city itself. He had known Holmes was following him, and now he had left no trace behind, as if he had anticipated this very outcome. Holmes felt the weight of the silence press in on him, the air heavy with anticipation. This was not just a man who was trying to evade capture. This was a man who was playing a game. The Ripper, Jack the Ripper, had been carefully orchestrating his movements, leaving just enough evidence to lure Holmes deeper into his web. And, now for the first time in this case, Holmes felt as though he was the one being led. He was no longer the hunter. He had become the prey. He turned on his heel, moving swiftly out of the courtyard and back into the winding alleyways. His mind raced through the possibilities, each one more baffling than the last. The figure had been in control of the situation, had allowed Holmes to follow him, knowing that the detective would eventually be led here to this dead end. But why? Was this some twisted game for the killer, a challenge designed to test Holmes's skills, to see if he could truly outsmart him? Or was there something deeper at play, something that only the killer understood? Holmes did not stop. He pressed on, moving through the alleys as if the city itself were a puzzle he was determined to solve. Every step brought him closer to the answer, or so he hoped. The fog closed in tighter around him, making it harder to see. His breath was steady, each exhale creating a thin mist that hung in the air for just a moment before being swallowed by the darkness. His mind did not wander. There was no room for distraction. He had learned long ago that in moments like these, when the world seemed to close in, the smallest detail could be the one that unlocked the mystery. Then, as if the very atmosphere were responding to his focus, a new sound broke the silence, a faint scrape of boots against cobblestones, the distinct echo of someone moving in the mist. Holmes froze, his ears straining to catch any further movement. The figure he had been following was close, too close. This time, Holmes did not wait. He turned sharply, his steps swift and calculated as he moved toward the sound. The fog made it difficult to see, but his instincts were sharp. He trusted his senses, knew that the figure was near. He rounded a corner quickly, moving toward an alley that appeared empty at first glance. His hand instinctively reached for his pocket, pulling out his revolver, though he knew he would not fire unless absolutely necessary. This was not a man who could be caught by force. This was a man who would slip away if Holmes showed too much aggression, who would turn the tables if Holmes made the wrong move. The game had shifted again, and now Holmes had to be more careful than ever. As he moved deeper into the alley, he saw him. The figure stood at the far end, his back partially turned, his posture relaxed but aware. Holmes paused, studying him, for a moment. This was the same man. He had been following him through the streets, through the fog, allowing Holmes to track him to this very point. The killer was toying with him, playing a game of cat and mouse. But there was something else in the man's demeanor. It was not just arrogance. There was something more, a sense of inevitability. Holmes took another step, the sound of his boots muffled by the wet ground. He did not speak, did not make his presence known just yet. The man did not turn, did not flinch. Holmes reached for his coat, adjusting it slightly as he moved into a better position. He needed to be closer. He needed to see the man's face, and he needed to know why the killer had stopped running. Why had he allowed Holmes to catch up to him? The figure finally turned, slowly, as though he had been expecting this moment all along. His eyes met Holmes, cold and calculating, as if the Ripper had been waiting for this exact confrontation. For a moment, neither spoke. The air between them was thick with tension, charged with the weight of the unspoken challenge that had been building since the moment Holmes had first set foot in Whitechapel. Then the man spoke, his voice low and smooth, carrying an edge of amusement. He did not sound like a man on the edge of madness, nor did he sound like someone who had been running for his life. He sounded in control, like a conductor leading an orchestra, like a man who knew exactly what was about to unfold. Holmes did not flinch. He did not react. He only watched, his mind calculating every detail, weighing the words as they left the man's lips. The Ripper was playing his part, but so was Holmes. The man took a step forward, closing the distance between them, and Holmes did not back away. He stood firm, his mind locked onto the present moment, focusing only on the man in front of him. The killer paused just before he reached Holmes, his eyes still locked onto the detective's face. There was a glint in his eye now, a flicker of something almost playful. Holmes could feel it. The man was enjoying this. He was enjoying the fact that he had led Holmes here, that he had played this game and won. But Holmes knew better than to show any sign of weakness. He stood tall, unshaken, even as the weight of the man's presence pressed in around him. Then the Ripper smiled. It was not a smile of recognition, nor one of camaraderie. It was a smile that spoke of something darker, something more sinister. The Ripper's amusement was not born of victory. It was born of understanding that for all Holmes's brilliance, he had yet to grasp the full extent of the game he was playing. Holmes watched as the man turned, his movements smooth, almost graceful. He did not hurry. He did not flee. He simply walked away, vanishing into the fog as if the mist itself had swallowed him whole. Holmes did not move. He stood still, his gaze fixed on the spot where the man had been. The fog had already begun to reclaim the space, the swirling mist erasing the last trace of the Ripper's presence. The game was far from over. But in that brief moment, Holmes had learned something crucial. The Ripper was not afraid of him. The Ripper wanted him to understand, wanted him to see that this was no ordinary pursuit. It was a game of wits, a battle of minds that had only just begun. Holmes took a deep breath, his mind already racing through the implications of this encounter. The Ripper had let him get close, let him see him, confront him, and yet he had allowed the moment to slip away. It was a challenge, a declaration of dominance. And in that challenge, Holmes saw something else. The Ripper was not just a killer. He was a man who believed he could never be caught. But Sherlock Holmes did not lose, not when the game was this close, and he would not stop until he had solved the riddle the Ripper had set before him. Sherlock Holmes stood in the center of the fog-laden street, the sharp scent of damp earth clinging to the air, his mind racing with the implications of the last few moments. The Ripper, the elusive killer who had tormented Whitechapel for months, had allowed him to come so close, too close. Holmes had felt the power shift in that instant, the thrill of the chase now, twisted into something darker, more dangerous. The Ripper had not run. He had stood his ground, allowed Holmes to feel the weight of his presence, and then, with a mocking smile, disappeared back into the shadows. Holmes remained unmoving, his mind refusing to let go of the moment, refusing to dismiss it as a mere failure. No, this was not failure. It was a message. Holmes turned and walked briskly down the alley, his coat swirling behind him. The streets felt empty now, as if the whole city had retreated into its own hollow shell, waiting for the next terror to strike. He had seen too many murders, too many victims to simply be dissuaded by the fact that one had slipped through his fingers. The truth was, the Ripper was playing a game, and Holmes was its intended adversary. He had been led into this, and now, more than ever, he had to remain focused, remain sharp. The killer had marked him as a threat, but in doing so, he had also marked himself. Holmes's gaze moved up and down the fog-slicked street. The sense of something beyond this world tugged at him, a feeling that would not release its grip, but he fought against it. He had been trained to see what others could not, to focus on the tangible, the material, the clues that whispered their secrets. And yet this case had moved into a realm where logic could not always explain the motives, the intentions of a man who killed with surgical precision and whose very existence seemed to haunt the air. His mind turned to the victim found earlier, the one who had been butchered with such precision. Holmes had seen this before, the way the wounds were placed with deliberate care. The slashes, though violent, followed a pattern, one that could not be made by someone acting in a fit of rage. The work was methodical, controlled. The Ripper was not acting out of madness. He was acting with a purpose, as if each kill were part of a larger design. Holmes quickened his pace as he walked toward the constable's office, his thoughts unraveling, the path before him. The police had been combing the streets for days, stumbling over evidence they did not understand, over trails they could not follow. But Holmes had seen it. He had felt it in the way the killer had watched him, in the precision of the killings, in the deliberate way he had left Holmes trailing behind. There was no madness here. There was intellect. There was a mind behind this, one that Holmes would outwit. The constable's office came into view, its yellow light cutting through the fog. Holmes approached, his footsteps slow but determined. He had not come here to find answers, but to find the missing pieces. The Ripper had left his signature, left behind his scent like a trail of breadcrumbs. But what had been left behind was not enough, not yet. He pushed open the door without knocking, his presence filling the small room, causing the officers seated within to look up in surprise. Holmes paid them no mind as he moved toward the desk where the files were spread open, details of the killings, of the patterns of the victims. The police had their theories, but Holmes knew better. He could see what they missed. Holmes began to sift through the files, his fingers skimming over the reports. He paused at the details of the latest victim, her body found in an alley just hours before. The location was familiar, one Holmes had passed only moments ago. But it wasn't the location that caught his attention, it was the timing. The Ripper had struck again, but this time, there had been a shift. The wound was deeper, more brutal. It was as if the killer had grown impatient. As Holmes examined the files, Watson entered, his brow furrowed with concern. He had always been the practical one, the one who tried to bring Holmes back to reality when his mind wandered too far into the unknown. But tonight Watson did not speak. He only observed, waiting for Holmes to speak first. Holmes continued to read, his brow furrowing as he pieced together the details. There was a connection between the locations, between the victims, but it wasn't a geographical one. It was something more elusive, something that stretched beyond mere geography. It was a game, a pattern, and the killer was leaving Holmes hints, taunting him with each step. But Holmes knew that the answers lay within the pattern, not in the spaces between it. Finally, Holmes closed the file with a soft snap. His gaze turned toward Watson, his expression unreadable. He did not speak immediately, instead taking a deep breath as though preparing himself for the next move. "We've been looking in the wrong place," Holmes said, his voice low but steady. He turned to Watson, his gaze piercing. "The Ripper has been leaving us clues, Watson. Not in the murders themselves, but in the way he moves, in the way he anticipates our every step." Watson frowned, confused. "But how can you be sure?" Holmes leaned forward, his hands resting on the desk as he looked over the files again. "Because he has allowed us to follow him. He has led us here, led us to believe that we are the ones in control of this case. But he is playing us, Watson. He is showing us just enough to make us think we are close and then pulling away, always staying one step ahead." Watson watched him, sensing the shift in Holmes's demeanor. The detective's mind was always quick, but now there was a sharpness to his thoughts that Watson had not seen before. Holmes was no longer simply reacting. He was anticipating. And that meant the Ripper's game was not yet over. It had only just begun. Holmes stood abruptly, his coat rustling as he turned toward the door. "We need to go to the heart of it, Watson, the place where it all began." The fog outside had thickened, but Holmes did not hesitate as he stepped back onto the streets. He was no longer chasing shadows. He was chasing the mind behind them. This was not just a hunt. It was a war of wits, and Sherlock Holmes had no intention of losing. With Watson at his side, Holmes moved into the fog, his sharp eyes scanning the streets, his mind focused on the puzzle that still eluded him. The Ripper had thought himself untouchable, but Holmes was determined to prove him wrong. The game was not yet finished, and Holmes had every intention of winning it.